Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Spiritual Edition, and we are continuing our reading of Flow by Mihaly C. I call him Mr. C because I don't know how to pronounce his last name. This book was inspired by an animated film that I saw recently. I'll put the link below in the YouTube description box. Um, I I don't think it has any association, but it has the same name. So that's all it was. I hope you check it out. It's a very good film. And we are going to continue our chapter 2 reading. And just a little recap, if there's a highlighted word or phrase, that means there's a footnote in the back, and we'll be reading that as well. And it's not an exact science. Sometimes he has specific words. Sometimes it's more like an idea. And sometimes I'll miss things. So, we'll see. So this is chapter 2, part 2. And I'm going to move the camera in just a little so you guys can read. Oops, not too much. Okay. All right. Here we go. Enter the self. And there's a footnote about that. So let's read that first. See what he says. Okay, the self. Psychologists have thought of innumerable ways of describing the self, from the social psychological approaches of George Herbert Mead, 1934-1970, and Sullivan, 1953, to the analytic psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, 1933-1961. Currently, however, psychologists try to avoid speaking of the self. Instead, they limit themselves to describing the self-concept. A good account of how this concept develops is given by Damon and Hart, 1982. Another approach uses the term self-efficacy, C. Bandura, 1982. The model of the self developed in these pages has been influenced by many sources and is described in Mr. C, 1985A, and Mr. C and Mr. C, 1988. Okay, enter the self. But what do those first-person pronouns refer to in the lines above? Those we's and ours that are supposed to control attention. Where is the I, the identity that decides what to do with the psychic energy generated by the nervous system? Where does the captain of the ship, the master of the soul, reside? I can tell you, you have two areas where the soul resides. One is in the heart chakra, and the other one is 12 inches above your head. The 12 inches above your head is called the higher soul, and the soul in your heart chakra is called the incarnated soul, according to esoteric teachings. Anyways, that's asked and answered. As soon as we consider these questions for even a short while, I realize that the I, or the self, as we shall refer to it from now on, is also one of the contents of consciousness. It is one that never strays very far from the focus of attention. Of course, my own self exists solely in my own consciousness. In that of others who know me, there will be versions of it, most of them probably unrecognizable likenesses of the original myself as I see me. So just a side note, he talks about many versions of himself. So just as there are many aspects of a person, of yourself, of who you are, there are also many aspects of God. And that's where we see all the different variations of quote unquote God, like the ascended masters, the Buddha, the Krishna, and all that stuff. Anyways, just a side note there. The self is no ordinary piece of information, however. In fact, it contains everything else that has passed through consciousness. All the memories, actions, desires, pleasures, and pains are included in it. And more than anything else, the self represents the hierarchy of goals that we have built up bit by bit over the years. The self of the political activist may become indistinguishable from his ideology. The self of the banker may become wrapped up in his investments. Of course, ordinarily, we do not think of ourselves in this way. At any given time, we are usually aware of only a tiny part of it, as when we become conscious of how we look, of what impression we're making, or of what we really would like to do if we could. We most often associate ourselves with our body, though sometimes we extend its boundaries to identify it with a car, house, or family. Yet, however much we are aware of it, the self is in many ways the most important element of consciousness, for it represents symbolically all of consciousness's other contents, as well as the pattern of their interrelations. The patient reader who has followed the argument so far might detect at this point a faint trace of circularity. If attention or psychic energy is directed by the self, and if the self is the sum of the contents of consciousness and the structure of its goals, and if the contents of consciousness and the goals are the result of different ways of investing attention, then we have a system that is going round and round with no clear causes or effects. At one point, we're saying that the self directs attention. At another, that attention determines the self. In fact, both these statements are true. Consciousness is not a strictly linear system, but one in which circular causality obtains. Attention shapes the self and is in turn shaped by it. An example of this type of causality is the experience of Sam Browning, one of the adolescents who are followed in our longitudinal research studies. Sam went to Bermuda for a Christmas holiday with his father when he was 15. At the time, he had no idea of what he wanted to do with his life. His self was relatively unformed, without an identity of its own. Sam had no clearly differentiated goals. He wanted exactly what other boys his age are supposed to want, either because of their genetic programs or because of what the social environment told them to want. In other words, he thought vaguely of going to college, then later finding some kind of well-paying job, getting married, and living somewhere in the suburbs. It's interesting because I think, just a side note, these are all ideas or thoughts that are not our own. These are societal thoughts. So unless someone who knows who he or she really is, he or she is going to be swayed by the type of thoughts that are, perpetuated by society. Sorry, side note. In Bermuda, Sam's father took him on an excursion to a coral barrier, and they dove underwater to explore the reef. Sam couldn't believe his eyes. He found the mysterious, beautifully dangerous environment so enchanting that he decided to become more familiar with it. He ended up taking a number of biology courses in high school and is now in the process of becoming a marine scientist. In Sam's case, an accidental event imposed itself on his consciousness, the challenging beauty of life in the ocean. He had not planned to have this experience. It was not the result of his self or his goals having directed attention to it. But once he became aware of what went on under sea, Sam liked it. The experience resonated with previous things he had enjoyed doing, with feelings he had about nature and beauty, with priorities about what was important that he had established over the years. And I would add too that past life experience would play into it too. If you believe in things like that, not everybody does, but I do. He felt the experience was something good, something worth seeking out again. Thus, he built this accidental event into a structure of goals to learn more about the ocean, to take courses, to go on to college and graduate school, to find a job as a marine biologist, which became a central element of his self. From then on, his goals directed Sam's attention to focus more and more closely on the ocean and and on its life, thereby closing the circle of causality. And I would argue that's just probably one circle. You know, there's going to be many circles in his lifetime. At first, attention helped to shape his self. When he noticed the beauties of the underwater world he had been exposed to by accident. Later, as he intentionally sought knowledge in marine biology, his self began to shape his attention. There is nothing very unusual about Sam's case, of course. Most people develop their attentional structures in similar ways. At this point, almost all of the components needed to understand how consciousness can be controlled are in place. We have seen that experience depends on the way we invest psychic energy, on the structure of attention. This, in turn, is related to goals and intentions. These processes are connected to each other by the self, or the dynamic mental representation we have of the entire system of our goals. These are the pieces that must be maneuvered if we wish to improve things. Of course, experience can also be improved by outside events, like winning $1 million in the lottery, marrying the right man or woman, or helping to change an unjust social system. But even these marvelous events must take their place in consciousness and be connected in positive ways to ourself before they can affect the quality of life. The structure of consciousness is beginning to emerge, but so far we have a rather static picture, one that has stretched out the various elements, but not the processes through which they interact. We need now consider what follows whenever attention brings a new bit of information into awareness. Only then will we be ready to get a thorough sense of how experience can be controlled and hence changed for the better. Disorder in consciousness, psychic entropy. Interesting word. Let's see what he has to say about that. Disorder in consciousness. Psychologists have studied negative emotions such as anger, distress, sadness, fear, shame, contempt, or disgust very extensively. Ekman, 1972, Frieda, 1968, Izzard, Kagan, and Zajonc, 1984, and Tompkins, 1962. But these investigators generally assume that each emotion is separately wired in the central nervous system as a response to a specific set of stimuli, instead of being an integrated response of the self system. Clinical psychologists and psychiatrists are familiar with dysphoric moods, such as anxiety and depression, which interfere with concentration and normal functioning. Beck, 1976, Bloomberg and Izzard, 1985, Hamilton, 1982, Lewenson and Liebert, 1972, Seligman et al., 1964. Disorder in consciousness, psychic entropy. One of the main forces that affects consciousness adversely is psychic disorder. That is, information that conflicts with existing intentions or distracts us from carrying them out. We give this condition many names, depending on how we experience it: pain, fear, rage, anxiety, or jealousy. All these varieties of disorder, excuse me, force attention to be diverted to undesirable objects, leaving us no longer free to use it according to our preferences. Psychic energy becomes unwieldy and ineffective. And I would add that psychic disorder is caused in some ways, not the only way, but in some ways, not knowing who you are. And really, knowing who you are is knowing who you truly are, which is your divine self. Which is why I think spiritual practices and spirituality is important, not religion, spirituality. There's a big difference. Consciousness can become disordered in many ways. For instance, in a factory that produces audiovisual equipment, Julio Martinez, one of the people we studied with the experience sampling method, is feeling listless on his job. As the movie projectors pass in front of him on the assembly line, he is distracted and can hardly keep up the rhythm of moves necessary for soldering the connections that are his responsibility. Usually he can do his part of the job with time to spare and then relax for a while to exchange a few jokes before the next unit stops at his station. But today he is struggling, and occasionally he slows down the entire line. When the man at the next station kids him about it, Julio snaps back irritably. From morning to quitting time, tension keeps building, and it spills over to his relationship with his coworkers. Julio's problem is simple, almost trivial, but it has been weighing heavily on his mind. One evening, a few days earlier, he noticed on arriving home from work that one of his tires was quite low. Next morning, the rim of the wheel was almost touching the ground. Julio would not receive his paycheck till the end of the following week, and it was certain he would not have enough money until then to have the tire patched up, let alone buy a new one. Credit was something he had not yet learned to use. The factory was out in the suburbs, about 20 miles from where he lived, and he simply had to reach it by 8 a.m. The only solution Julio could think of was to drive gingerly to the service station in the morning, fill the tire with air, and then drive to work as quickly as possible. After the work, the tire was low again, so he inflated it as the gas station near the factory at a gas station near the factory and drove home. On the morning of the question, he had been doing this for 3 days, hoping the procedure would work until the next paycheck. But today, by the time he made it to the factory, he could hardly steer the car because the wheel with the bum tire was so flat. All through the day, he worried, will I make it home tonight? How will I get to work tomorrow morning? These questions kept intruding in his mind, disrupting concentration on his work and throwing a pall on his moods. Julio is a good example of what happens when the internal order of the self is disrupted. The basic pattern is always the same. Some information that conflicts with an individual's goals appears in consciousness, depending on how central that goal is to the self and on how severe the threat to it is. Some amount of attention will have to be mobilized to eliminate the danger, leaving the less attention free to deal with other matters. For Julio, holding a job was a goal of very high priority. If he were to lose it, all his other goals would be compromised. Therefore, keeping it was essential to maintain the order of his self. The flat tire was jeopardizing the job, and consequently, it absorbed a great deal of his psychic energy. Whenever information disrupts consciousness by threatening its goals, we have a condition of inner disorder or psychic entropy, a disorganization of the self that impairs its effectiveness. Prolonged experiences of this kind can weaken the self to the point that it is no longer able to invest attention and pursue its goals. It's called chronic stress, prolonged psychic entropy. That's my definition. It's called chronic stress, and you can become sick from it, physically sick. Julio's problem was relatively mild and transient. A more chronic example of psychic entropy is the case of Jim Harris, a greatly talented high school sophomore who was in one of our surveys. Alone at home on a Wednesday afternoon, he was standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom his parents used to share. On the box at his feet, a tape of the Grateful Dead was playing, as it had been almost without interruption for the past week. Jim was trying on one of his father's favorite garments, a heavy green chamois shirt his father had worn whenever the two had gone camping together. Passing his hand over the warm fabric, Jim remembered the cozy feeling of being snuggled up to his dad in the smoky tent while the loons were laughing across the lake. In his right hand, Jim was holding a pair of large sewing scissors. The sleeves were too long for him, and he was wondering if he dared to trim them. Dad would be furious. Would he even notice? A few hours later, Jim was lying in his bed. On the nightstand beside him was a bottle of bottle of aspirin, now empty, although there had been 70 tablets in it just a while before. Jim's parents had separated a year earlier, and now they were getting a divorce. During the week while he was in school, Jim lived with his mother. Friday evenings, he packed up to go and stay in his father's new apartment in the suburbs. One of the problems with this arrangement was that he was never able to be with his friends. During the week, they were all too busy, and on weekends, Jim was stranded in foreign territory where he knew nobody. He spent his free time on the phone trying to make connections with his friends, or he listened to tapes that he felt echoed and or he listened to tapes that he felt echoed the solitude gnawing inside him. But the worst thing Jim felt was that his parents were constantly battling for his loyalty. They kept making snide remarks about each other, trying to make Jim feel guilty if he showed any interest or love toward one of the presence of the other. Help, he scribbled in his diary a few days before his attempted suicide. I don't want to hate my mom. I don't want to hate my dad. I wish they stopped doing this to me. Luckily, that evening, Jim's sister noticed the empty bottle of aspirin and called her mother. And Jim ended up in the hospital where his stomach was pumped and he was set back on his feet in a few days. Thousands of kids his age are not that fortunate. The flat tire that threw Julio into a temporary panic and the divorce that almost killed Jim don't act directly as physical causes, producing a physical effect, as for instance, one billiard ball hitting another and making it carom in a predictable direction. I think I pronounced that right, carom? Carom? I don't know. I've never seen that word before. But, I don't play billiard ball. I don't play billiard. Anyways, sorry. Little sidetrack there, a little squirrel there. The outside event appears in consciousness purely as information, without necessarily having a positive or negative value attached to it. It is the self that interprets that raw information in the context of its own interests and determines whether it is harmful or not. For instance, if Julio had had more money or some credit, his problem would have been perfectly innocuous. If in the past he had invested more psychic energy in making friends on the job, the flat tire would not have created panic because he could have always asked one of his co-workers to give him a ride, but for a few days. And if he had had a stronger sense of self-confidence, the temporary setback would not have affected him as much because he would have trusted his ability to overcome it eventually. Similarly, if Jim had been more independent, the divorce would not have affected him as deeply. But at his age, his goals must have still been bound up too closely with those of his mother and father, so that the split between them also split his sense of self. Had he had closer friends or a longer record of goals successfully achieved, his self would have had the strength to maintain its integrity. He was lucky that after the breakdown, his parents realized the predicament and sought help for themselves and their son, reestablishing a stable enough relationship with Jim to allow him to go on with the task of building a sturdy self. Every piece of information we process gets evaluated for its bearing on the self. Does it threaten our goals? Does it support them? Or is it neutral? News of the fall of the stock market will upset the banker, but it might reinforce the sense of self of the political activist. A new piece of information will either create disorder in consciousness by getting us all worked up to face the threat, or to reinforce our goals, or by freeing up psychic energy. Order in consciousness, flow. There's a footnote about that. Okay. All right. Order. What order or psychic negentropy, boy, that's a fancy word, implies will be discussed in the pages below. See also Mr. C 1982A and Mr. C. and Larson, 1984. Basically, it refers to the lack of conflict among the bits of information present in an individual's consciousness. When the information is in harmony with a person's goals, the consciousness of that person is ordered. The same concept applies also to lack of conflict between individuals when their goals are in harmony with each other. Order in consciousness, flow. The opposite state from the condition of psychic entropy is optimal experience. When the information that keeps coming into awareness is congruent with goals, psychic energy flows effortlessly. There is no need to worry, no reason to question one's adequacy. But whatever one does stop to think about oneself, whenever one does stop to think about oneself, the evidence is encouraging. You are doing all right. The positive feedback strengthens the self, and more attention is free to deal with the outer and inner environment. Another one of our respondents, a worker named Rico Medellin, gets his feeling quite often on his job. He works in the same factory as Julio a little further up on the assembly line. The task he has to perform on each unit that passes in front of his station should take 43 seconds to perform, the same exact operation almost 600 times in a working day. Most people would grow tired of such work very soon, but Rico has been at this job for over 5 years, and he still enjoys it. The reason is that he approaches his task in the same way an Olympic athlete approaches his event. How can I beat my record? Like the runner who trains for years to shave a few seconds off his best performance on the track, Rico has trained himself to better his time on the assembly line. With the painstaking care of a surgeon, he has worked out a private routine for how to use his tools, how to do his moves. After 5 years, his best average for a day has been 28 seconds per unit. In part, he tries to improve his performance to earn a bonus and the respect of his supervisors. But most often, he does not even let on to others that he is ahead and lets his success pass unnoticed. It is enough to know that he can do it because when he is working at top performance, the experience is so enthralling that it is almost painful for him to slow down. It's better than anything else, Rico said. It's a whole lot better than watching TV. Rico knows that very soon he will reach the limit beyond which he will no longer be able to improve his performance at his job. So twice a week, he takes evening courses in electronics. When he has his diploma, he will seek a more complex job, one that presumably he will confront with the same enthusiasm he has shown so far. For Pam Davis, it is much easier to achieve this harmonious, effortless state when she works. As a young lawyer in a small partnership, she's fortunate to be involved in complex, challenging cases. She spends hours in the library chasing down references and outlining possible courses of actions for senior partners of the firm to follow. Often her concentration is so intense that she forgets to have lunch, and by the time she realizes that she's hungry, it is dark outside. While she's immersed in her job, every piece of information fits. Even when she is temporarily frustrated, she knows what causes the frustration, and she believes that eventually the obstacle can be overcome. These examples illustrate what we mean by optimal experience. They are situations in which attention can be freely invested to achieve a person's goals because there is no disorder to straighten out, no threat for the self to defend against. We have called this state the flow experience because this is the term many of the people we interviewed had used in their description of how it felt to be in top form. It is like floating. I was carried on by the flow. It is the opposite of psychic entropy. In fact, it is sometimes called negentropy, and those who attain it develop a stronger, more self-confident self because more of their psychic energy has been invested successfully in goals they themselves had chosen to pursue. And there is a footnote about flow. The original research and the theoretical model of the flow experience were first fully reported in Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, Mr. C, 1975. Since then, a great number of works have used the flow concept, and extensive new research has been accumulating. A few examples are Victor Turner's 1974 application of the concept to anthropology, Mitchell's 1983 to sociology, and Crook's 1980 to evolution. Akblad, 1981, Amabile, 1983, and Deci and Ryan, 1985, have used it in developing motivational theories. For summaries of the various research findings, see Massamini and Inghilleri, 1986, and Mr. C and Mr. C, 1988. And Abraham Hicks calls the flow experience, describes it as tuned in, tapped in, turned on. I like that. I like that phrase a lot. Tuned in, tapped in, turned on. When a person is able to recognize his or her consciousness so as to experience flow as often as possible, the quality of life is inevitably going to improve because, as in the case of Rico and Sam, even the usually boring routines of work becomes purposeful and enjoyable. In flow, we are in control of our psychic energy, and everything we do adds order to consciousness. One of our respondents, a well-known West Coast rock climber, explains precisely the tie between the avocation that gives him a profound sense of flow and the rest of his life. It's exhilarating to come closer and closer to self-discipline. You make your body go and everything hurts. Then you look back in awe at the self, at what you've done. It just blows your mind. It leads to ecstasy, to self-fulfillment. If you win these battles enough, that battle against yourself, at least for a moment, it becomes easier to win the battles in the world. And there's a footnote about that. That quote was from Mr. C, 1975, page 95. Okay. Sorry for the back and forth. I hope that's not too confusing or distracting. The battle is not really against the self, but against the entropy that brings disorder to consciousness. It is really a battle for the self. It is a struggle for establishing control over attention. The struggle does not necessarily have to be physical, as in the case of the climber. But anyone who has experienced flow knows that the deep enjoyment it provides requires an equal degree of disciplined concentration, complexity, and the growth of the self. Following a flow experience, the organization of the self is more complex than it had been before. It is by becoming increasingly complex that the self might be said to grow. Complexity is the result of two broad psychological processes: differentiation and integration. Differentiation implies a movement toward uniqueness, toward separating oneself from others. Integration refers to its opposite, a union with other people, with ideas and entities beyond the self. A complex self is one that succeeds in combining these opposite tendencies. The self becomes more differentiated as a result of flow, because overcoming a challenge inevitably leaves a person feeling more capable, more skilled. As the rock climber said, you look back in awe at the self, at what you've done. It just blows your mind. After each episode of flow, a person becomes more of a unique individual, less predictable, possessed of rare skills. Complexity is often thought to have negative meaning, synonymous with difficulty and confusion. That may be true, but only if we equate it with differentiation alone. Yet complexity also involves a second dimension, the integration of autonomous parts. A complex engine, for instance, not only has many separate components, each performing a different function, but also demonstrates a high sensitivity because each of the components is in touch with all the others. Without integration, a differentiated system would be a confusing mess. And let's read the footnote on complexity. Complexity is a function of how well the information in a person's consciousness is differentiated and integrated. A complex person is one who is able to access precise, discrete information and yet is able to relate the various pieces to each other. For example, a person whose desires, emotions, thoughts, values, and actions are strongly individuated yet do not contradict each other. See, for instance, Mr. C, 1970, Mr. C and Mr. C, 1988, and Mr. C and Larson, 1984. The notion of complexity used here is related to the same concept as used by some evolutionary biologists, e.g. Dobzhansky, 1962, 1967, and it has been influenced by the poetic insights of Teilhard de Chardin, 1965. A very promising definition of complexity in physical systems, defined as thermodynamic depth, was being worked on by Hans Pagels, 1988, before his recent untimely death. By his definition, the complexity of a system is the difference between the amount of information needed to describe the system in its present state and the amount needed to describe all the states it might have been in at the point at which it changed from the previous state. Applying this to the psychology of the self, one might say that a complex person was one whose behaviors and ideas could not be easily explained and whose development was not obviously predictable. I don't know, I gotta read that again because I think everybody's a complex person, in my opinion. Oops, there's a little thing here. Sorry. My OCD here. Okay, flow helps to integrate the self because in that state of deep concentration, consciousness is unusually well ordered. Thoughts, intentions, feelings, and all the senses are focused on the same goal. Experience is in harmony, and when the flow episode is over, one feels more together than before, not only internally, but also with respect to other people and to the world in general. In the words of the climber whom we quoted earlier, there's no place that more draws the best from human beings than a mountaineering situation. Nobody hassles you to put your mind and body under tremendous stress to get to the top. Your comrades are there, and you all feel the same way anyway. You're all in it together. Who can you trust more in the 20th century than these people? People after the same self-discipline as yourself, following the deeper commitment. A bond like that with other people is in itself an ecstasy. And that quote about there's no place is from Mr. C, 1975, page 94. Okay. A self that is only differentiated, not integrated, may attain great individual accomplishments, but risks being mired in self-centered egotism. By the same token, a person whose self is based exclusively on integration will be connected and secure, but lack autonomous individuality. Only when a person invests equal amounts of psychic energy in these two processes and avoids both selfishness and conformity is the self likely to reflect complexity. The self becomes complex as a result of experiencing flow. Paradoxically, it is when we act freely for the sake of the action itself rather than for ulterior motives that we learn to become more than what we were. When we choose a goal and invest ourselves in it to the limits of our concentration, whatever we do will be enjoyable. And once we have tasted this joy, we will redouble our efforts to retaste it again. This is the way the self grows. It is the way Rico was able to draw so much out of his ostensibly boring job on the assembly line, or R from his poetry. It is the way E overcame her disease to become an influential scholar and a powerful executive. Flow is important both because it makes the present instant more enjoyable and because it builds the self-confidence that allows us to develop skills and make significant contributions to humankind. The rest of this volume will explore more thoroughly what we know about optimal experiences, how we feel and under what conditions they occur. Even though there is no easy shortcut to flow, it is possible if one understands how it works to transform life, to create more harmony in it, and to liberate the psychic energy that otherwise would be wasted in boredom or worry. And Buddhists call that being in the moment, being mindful in the moment, right? Well, end of chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed that. And we will continue our reading next week. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day and happy spring. Today is not the first day of spring, but we are entering spring. So anyways, okay, bye-bye now. You guys all have a great day.